On tradition, Theodor W. Adorno 194 telos 75-82 defines tradition as recalling the continuity of generations, physical proximity, opposition to rationality, incompatibility with bourgeois society, absence of traditional aspects of culture in the United States, tradition lost as not being able to be replaced aesthetically, false tradition as wallowing in false wealth, subjectively ruined or ideologically corrupted, history as objectively maintaining its hegemony over everything. One tradition comes from trader to hand down. It recalls the continuity of generations, what is handed down by one member to another, even the heritage of handicraft. The image of handing down expresses physical proximity, immediacy, one hand should receive from another. Such immediacy is the more or less natural relation of a familial sort. The category of tradition is essentially feudal, just as Werner Somberg called feudal economy tradition. Tradition is opposed to rationally, even though the one took shape in the other. Its medium is not consciousness but the pregiven, unreflected and binding existence of social forms, the actuality of the past. Unintentionally this notion of binding existence was transmitted to the intellectual spiritual sphere. Tradition in the strict sense is incompatible with bourgeois society. The principle of equal exchange, as in production, did not abolish that of the family, but it did subordinate the family to it. Frequent periods of inflation have demonstrated how obviously anachronistic the idea of inheritance has become, and intellectual inheritance was no less prone to crisis. In linguistic expressions for tradition, this immediacy, from one hand to another, is merely a remnant within the social machinery of universal mediation which is dominated by the commodity character of things. Technology long ago allowed us to forget the hand that created it and made it an extension of itself. In view of the technological modes of production, handicraft has as little substance as the concept of craftsmanship itself, which once ensured tradition, aesthetic tradition in particular. In a radically bourgeois country like the US, all the consequences of this came to pass. Tradition became either a questionable value, or an imported article to be valued only as a curiosity. The absence of traditional aspects of culture in the US, and of those experiences linked with them towards a consciousness of temporal continuity. What fails to establish its immediate social usefulness in the marketplace does not count and is forgotten. Even when someone dies, it is as if he had never lived. He is as replaceable as anything functional. Only what has no function is irreplaceable. This explains the desperate and archaic embalming rituals of the Americans. As if by magic, they would like to recapture the consciousness of time that has been lost, although this loss is rooted in social relations. Europe is not ahead of the US in this respect. It could learn tradition at home, but instead it follows the US of its own accord and in no sense needs to imitate it. Often noted in Germany, the crisis of historical consciousness, including the sheer ignorance even of the most recent past, is only a symptom of a more fundamental predicament. Manifestly, people are experiencing the breakdown of temporal continuity. The fact that time as a philosophical topic has become so popular indicates that it is vanishing from the spirit of the living. The Italian philosopher Enrico Castelli has written a book dealing with this problem. Contemporary art as a whole responds to this loss of tradition. Having lost what tradition guaranteed, the self-evident one originally published, relation to its subject, to its materials and techniques, it must reflect upon them from within. Art now senses the hollow and fictional character of traditional aspects of culture. Important artists chip them away like plaster with a hammer. Whatever maintains an orientation to objectivity shares this hostility to tradition. To complain about it and to recommend tradition as a cure is entirely useless. This contradicts the very essence of tradition. Utilitarian rationality, the consideration of how nice it would be to have tradition in a world allegedly or actually lacking any coherence, cannot prescribe what it invalidates to tradition. Genuinely lost cannot be replaced aesthetically. But bourgeois society does precisely that, and its motives for doing so are genuine. The legs the bourgeois principle tolerates otherness. The more urgently it appeals to tradition and cites what then appears from the outside as value, it is obliged to do this because that reason which governs processes of production and reproduction, and which presides over everything which merely comes into being or already exists, is not the whole of reason. The thoroughly bourgeois Max Weber defined reason as the relation between means and ends, not of means as such. These he consigned to subjective, irrational decision. In the control of the few over the means of production, and in the relentless conflicts this generates, the whole remains as unreasonable, fateful and threatening as it was always. The more rational the coherence and closure of the whole, the more dreadful becomes its power over the living, as well the inability of their reason to change it. But if what subsists in such irrationality wants to justify its existence rationally, it must seek support from the very irrationality it eradicates. It must turn to tradition, which, of course, immediately recoils from this embrace and becomes false by the very appeal to it. Society applies tradition systematically like an adhesive. In art, it is held out as a pacifier to soothe people's qualms about their atomization, including temporal atomization. From the beginning of the bourgeois period, members of the Third Estate have sensed something lacking in their progress and their reason, which suppresses virtually all the qualitative distinctions of life. Its mainstream poets have mocked the pre-due progress from Molière's comedy La Bourgeois Gentilhomme to Gottfried Keller's La Tumuli family, which bore fake ancestral portraits. Snobbery is imminent to a form of society wherein formal equality serves substantive inequality and domination. All literature which derides snobbery only conceals the wound on which it pours salt. Manipulated and neutralized by the bourgeois principle, tradition eventually turns into a toxin. As soon as genuine traditional aspects of culture, significant artworks of the past, are idolized as relics, they degenerate into elements of an ideology which relishes the past so that the present will remain unaffected by it, at the cost of increasing narrowness and rigidity. Those who cherish the past and refuse to surrender their love of it so as not to become impoverished, immediately expose themselves to an insidiously inspired misunderstanding. Namely that they might not be so dedicated after all and might even be willing to embrace the present false tradition, which arose almost simultaneously with the consolidation of bourgeois society, wallows in false wealth. This wealth enticed the new romanticism even more than the old. Even the concept of world literature, though certainly liberated from the confines of national literature, was tempted by it from the beginning. The wealth was false because it was utilized in the bourgeois spirit of manipulating property, as if the artist had access to whatever aesthetic materials and forms historicism authenticated as precious and refined. As if each and every tradition would surrender itself to the artist precisely because they are no longer substantial or binding. Hegel defined the new art, which he called romantic, in just this way. Goethe did not resist the temptation of false wealth, only the allergy against tradition today is immune. Whereas everything appears to be at the service of the allegedly autonomous artist, no good can come from the treasures he has unearthed. As we know, those neoclassical orientations in literature, those of Jean Cocteau, and the later, André Gide came to naught. Any artist who makes use of them fabricates arts and crafts. He borrows from culture what contradicts his own position, empty forms which cannot be filled because no authentic art has ever fulfilled its form. After tradition disintegrates, the artist experiences it much more through the resistance it puts up whenever he attempts to capture it. What today is called minimalism in the most diverse artistic media corresponds to the experience that nothing more need be used than what is necessary for the work here and now. The accelerating pace of change in aesthetic programs and trends, which the Philistine dismisses as fashionable nonsense, arises from the constantly increasing compulsion of the riff first noted by Paul Valéry. The relation to tradition is supplanted by a canon of prohibitions. More and more is engulfed by this canon as critical self-consciousness expands, including what is apparently eternal, norms borrowed either directly or indirectly from antiquity, which were mobilized in the bourgeois epoch to combat the dissolution of the traditional aspects of culture, for while tradition is subjectively ruined or ideologically corrupted, history objectively maintains its hegemony over everything and over everything into which it has seeped. The positivist dogma, often difficult to distinguish from aesthetic objectivity, that the world is made up of what is immediately given, without the deeper dimension of what it became, is just as illusory as the authoritarian appeal to tradition. Whatever imagines itself to be derived from nothing, unadulterated by history, will be the first victim of history unconsciously and thus fatefully. Archaic ontological tendencies in philosophy are a case in point. The writer who shuns the deceptive aspects of tradition and assumes it no longer has anything to do with him still is constrained by it, above all through language. Literary language is not a random collection of markers. The value of each and every word, each and every combination of words objectively derives its meaning from its history, and this history embraces the historical process as such. Bertolt Brecht once expected salvation from forgetting, which in the meantime has become an expression of mechanical emptiness. The poverty of the here and now has turned out to be nothing more than the abstract negation of false wealth, in many cases the apotheosis of bourgeois puritanism. The passing moment, free of any trace of memory, suffers from the delusion that what is mediated socially is a natural form a raw materiel. However, any compromising sacrifices of historically established techniques are regressive. The truth of renunciation is not blind triumph but despair. The bliss of tradition praised by reactionaries is not only an ideology. Whoever suffers from the universal domination of what merely exists and yearns for what has never existed might well feel a greater affinity with the marketplace in southern Germany than with the cofferdam, even though he knows how much restored buildings also preserve the stifling atmosphere inside them. Their stale stuffiness is the complement of technological catastrophe. To insist on the absolute absence of tradition is as naive as the obstinate insistence on it. Both are ignorant of the past that persists in their allegedly pure relation to objects. Both are unaware of the dust and debris which cloud their allegedly clear vision. But it is inhuman to forget, because accumulated suffering will be forgotten, and the historical trace on things, words, colors and sounds is always of past suffering. Thus tradition today poses an insoluble contradiction. There is no tradition today and none can be conjured, yet when every tradition has been extinguished the march toward barbarism will begin. This antinomy prescribes the only possible relation between consciousness and tradition. Kant's assertion that the critical path alone remains open is one of those established maxims whose truth content is much greater than its original intent. It concerns not only the particular tradition of the rationalist school Kant renounced but tradition as a whole. Not to forget tradition and yet riot to affirm it means to confront it with the most advanced stage of consciousness, and to pose the question of what passes and what does not. There is no eternal canon, even the notion of a German literary anthology is no longer conceivable. But there is a relation to the past which, though not conservative, facilitates the survival of many works by refusing to compromise. Despite their restorative intentions, important traditionalists of the past generation like the members of the Stefan George School and Hugo von Hofmannsthal, Rudolf Burckhardt and Rudolf Alexander Schroeder grasped something of this feeling insofar as they preferred the sober and concise to the idealistic formulation. They already had an ear for what sounds hollow in a text. They registered the passage of tradition into unpretentiousness, into a position which no longer posits itself. They preferred those works in which the truth content is deeply embedded in the material to those in which it hovers over them like an ideology, and thus is none at all. Nothing traditional is better suited than this subterranean tradition of anti-traditionalism to link up with the betrayed and reviled aspect of the Enlightenment in Germany. But even the respectable desire for restoration had to pay its dues. Its self-confidence became the pretext for an entire genre of sophisticated writing. The high-principled imitators of Adalbert, Stifter and interpreters of Johann Peter Hebel are today as common as the grandiose gesture. Not only were ostensibly innocent gestures incorporated in the general manipulation of sanctioned cultural products, even significant older works were destroyed in the rescue operation. They refused to be restored to what they once were. Objectively, not only in reflected consciousness these works shed various layers according to their own dynamics. This process alone inaugurates a tradition worth pursuing. Its criterion is correspondence which, as something new, throws light on the present and receives its illumination from the past. Such correspondence is not synonymous with empathy and immediate affinity, but requires distance. That traditionalism is distinguished from tradition's moment of truth in that it reduces distance and reaches for the irretrievable, which begins to speak only in the consciousness of irretrievability. Samuel Beckett's admiration for Theodor Fontaine's Effie Briest is a model of genuine affinity through distance. It evidences how little tradition conceived in terms of the concept of correspondence tolerates what is traditional as a model. 6. The critical approach to tradition never says this no longer interests us, which is nothing other than the impertinent subsumption of the present under a loose historical category like mannerism, which surreptitiously adopts the attitude. We've seen it all before. Such dispositions reduce everything to nothing. They pander to superstitions of an uninterrupted historical continuity, and thus affirm the historical verdict they can form. Where this peculiarity, with respect to the past, has become second nature, as in the reception of Heinrich Ibsen and Frank Wedekind, one ignores what is left unrealized, historically undeveloped, or, as in the case of the liberation of women, remains merely ambivalent. But such idiosyncrasies touch upon the true theme of rethinking tradition. That which was left along the way, passed over or overpowered. That which is out of date, what is alive in tradition seeks refuge there and not in the permanence of works which have stood the test of time. All this eludes the sovereign perspective of historicism, in which the superstition of immortality fatally combines with the petty fear of what is old-fashioned. The vitality of a work is lodged deep within, under layers concealed in earlier phases which manifest themselves only when others have withered and fallen away. Everything ephemeral in Wedekind springs awakening the student desks, the dimly lit lavatories in 19th-century homes, the unspeakable river outside of town at dusk, the tea which the mother brings the children on a tray. The chatter of teenage girls about the engagement of the assistant forest to fall, forms an image of something that has always been and will always be, but only after the appeals of the play. For modern enlightenment and the tolerance of youth have long been fulfilled and no longer matter. What renders Wedekind's judgment obsolete is the insight into the substance of the object which allows for its reactualization. Only an attitude which raises tradition to consciousness without succumbing to it is able to deal with this. Just as tradition must be shielded from the fury of disappearance, so it must be wrested from its no less mythical authority. 7. The critical relation to tradition as the medium of its preservation is not only concerned with the past but also with the quality of aesthetic production in the present. To the extent that it is authentic, this production does not begin cavalierly from scratch, nor does it attempt to outdo one contrived method with another. Rather, it is a determinate negation. In Beckett's plays, the traditional form of the drama is transformed in all respects through parody. The dreadful games in which rubber weights are lifted for deadly serious comic effect and in the end everything remains the same as it was at the beginning correspond to conceptions of rising and falling action, of vicissitude, catastrophe, the development of character. Such categories are the illusory superstructure suspended above what becomes the real source of fear and suffering, the unchanging nature of existence. The collapse of this superstructure in the literal performance of its critique on stage provides the material and content of a dramatic art which does not want to know what it is saying. To this extent, the cliché of the anti-drama is not a bad choice, nor is the concept of the anti-hero. Beckett's key figures are only shivering scarecrows, which are all that remains of the subject which once dominated the scene. There Downing passes judgment on the ideal of the self-righteous personality, which perishes quite deservedly in Beckett's plays. To characterize Beckett's works and those of his followers as the drama of the absurd is certainly inadequate. It concedes all too much to the very conventional wisdom on trial here, and it does so because it designates as absurd not the objective senselessness this art exposes, but its subjective perspective. Conscious agreement seeks to swallow even what it finds distasteful. Nevertheless, the awkward designation absurd is not completely incorrect. It considers progressive literature to be the concretely executed critique of the traditional concept of meaning, that the world makes sense, which so-called high art used to affirm even and especially when it chose tragedy as its law. The affirmative character of tradition is collapsing. By the very fact of its existence, tradition claims that temporal succession sustains and transmits meaning. To the extent that it has value, the new literature analogous to the new music and painting radically unsets the ideology of meaning which was so thoroughly unmasked in the catastrophe that it even cast doubt on the meaningfulness of the past as well. It renounces tradition and follows it nevertheless. It takes Hamlet's question to be or not to be so literally that it dares to provide the answer, not to be, for which tradition has as little room as do fairy tales for the victory of the monster over the prince. This type of productive critique does not even require philosophical reflection because it obtains through the skill of the artist and is in tune with his precise sensitivities and technical control, both of which are replete with historical experience. Each of Beckett's minimalist reductions, down to the structure of language and the spiteful jokes, presupposes the very platitude and differentiation he refuses to let die in trash cans, scent piles and urns. This corresponds to the dissatisfaction of modern novelists with the fiction of an omniscient narrator. Tradition goes against the grain of every artist irritated by its ornamental character and its fabrication of meaning where there is none. Each remains true to this meaning by refusing to be deceived by it. 8. The relation between authentic works and critique is no less dialectical than that between authors and critique. As little as a poet needed to be a philosopher, as little need he become one if this implies confusing the inflated meaning of a work, rightly and horrendously dubbed its message with its truth content. Beckett passionately rejects any reflection on the allegedly symbolic character of his productions. The point is that no positive substance can be observed. Nevertheless, something substantial has changed in the approach of authors to their work. The fact that they neither can locate themselves in tradition nor function in a vacuum destroys the concept of artistic naivete, so intimately related to tradition. Historical consciousness is concentrated in the indispensable reflection on what is and what is no longer possible, on the clear insight into techniques and materials and how they fit together. This radically disposes of the sloppiness Gustav Mahler equated with tradition. However, tradition also survives in the anti-traditional consciousness of what has been rendered historically obsolete. The relation of the artist to his work has become at once totally blind and totally transparent. The assumption that one may now speak plainly and without constraint is entirely traditional. Under the delusion of the immediacy of individuality, it can only result in a kind of writing that is no longer possible. But this does not represent the triumph of the sentimentally reflective artist that has been contrasted with the naive artist in aesthetic understanding since classicism and romanticism. He becomes the object of a second reflection which revokes his right to posit meaning, his right to the idea that idealism once granted him. To this extent progressive aesthetic consciousness converged with the naive artist, whose non-conceptual intuition never had any pretensions to meaning. Perhaps this is why it succeeded from time to time. But even this hope can no longer be relied on. Poetry redeems its truth content only when it repels tradition at its closest point of contact. Whoever seeks to avoid betraying the bliss which tradition still promises in some of its images, and the possibilities buried beneath its reigns must abandon that tradition which turns possibilities and meanings into lies. Only that which inexorably denies tradition may once again retrieve it. Yet,